I'm Captain Marcus Hale, 38, and for most of my career, I have lived in the quiet space between what people see on a base and what actually keeps it moving. I work as a logistics officer in the National Guard, and that means I understand the real operational backbone of this place, the flow of fuel, supplies, reports, and movements that everyone depends on but rarely thinks about. Most days, I slip through the halls unnoticed because the work only matters when something breaks. And I have spent years making sure nothing does. That morning began like any other until I walked in 8 minutes late and found Major Reddick waiting for me near the operations wing. He lit into me the second he saw me, his voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of the building while he acted like my lateness threatened national security. I stood there taking the hit because that was the pattern. He pushed weight down, and I carried it, quietly, consistently, without pushing back. The truth was simple. I had stopped behind the motor pool after parking my truck because I saw a man sitting near the loading dock with his shoulders slumped like he had been carrying the world. His clothes were dusty, and his old work boots looked like they had marched through months of hard jobs. He never asked me for anything. He just looked hungry in a way that hit something familiar in my chest. I handed him my lunch, and he looked up with a sharp, steady expression that made me pause for a moment before I walked away. At the time, it felt like nothing more than a human moment, a small act in the middle of a long day, but it would shift everything that came after. Major Reddick had a way of filling every hallway with noise long before he opened his mouth. His whole style of leadership depended on volume and posture, the kind that made him feel bigger even when the facts did not back him up. He cared more about how things looked than how things worked, and that meant people like me stayed in the shadows so he could stand in the light. For 12 years, I had cleaned up his missed reports, fixed his failed inspections, and patched over logistics gaps that should never have existed in the first place. None of it earned a word of acknowledgement, but I learned to live with that because keeping the unit steady mattered more than credit. That morning, he marched ahead of me with fast, heavy steps, acting like bringing me into a briefing was a burden he had to carry. He kept muttering about how this meeting could define the unit for the next decade and how my small mistakes could embarrass him in front of senior leadership. I stayed quiet because anything I said would only make him louder. The air felt tight, crowded with his ego, and I could feel my pulse rising with each step toward the conference room. When we stepped inside, the room shifted from the usual buzz to a rigid stillness. High-ranking officers sat around the long table, flipping through folders and waiting for the new commander to speak. Reddick straightened his shoulders and smoothed his uniform like he was preparing for a spotlight. I kept my eyes low until a figure at the far end of the table pulled my attention upward. It was the man from behind the motor pool, the one who had eaten the lunch I gave away without thinking. The man who shared my sandwich was wearing a colonel's rank. I froze for a second longer than I should have, long enough to feel my heartbeat stumble and catch again. His uniform looked crisp, but his boots told another story. They were polished, clean enough for a briefing, but the creases and worn edges showed months of work in places where officers rarely go. Those boots were the same kind I saw earlier that morning, planted in the dirt behind the loading dock when he sat with his elbows on his knees and his head down. Seeing them here felt like a quiet signal, a message that he had been evaluating more than the base that day. Reddick did not notice any of it. He launched into his usual performance, trying to project confidence with every gesture. I stood behind him, watching the colonel watch us, and I realized he was not the type of leader who spoke first. He observed, measured, and waited for the truth to present itself. In that moment, the balance in the room shifted, even if no one else felt it yet, and I understood that everything Reddick had built on appearances was about to be tested. Major Reddick launched into the briefing like he had been waiting his entire life for an audience. His voice filled the room with layered buzzwords about leadership, readiness, and tactical synergy, each one stacked on top of the next until they lost any real meaning. He moved his hands in wide arcs, as if painting a picture of excellence that had never existed outside his imagination. I sat behind him, watching the way heads around the table shifted slightly, not toward him but away from the force of his performance. It felt like the whole room was bracing for impact. He stepped sideways and dragged me into the spotlight with a hand on my shoulder. The weight of his palm dug into the fabric of my uniform as he called me the guy who handled grunt-level tasks, the kind of praise meant to disguise an insult. My jaw tightened before I could stop it, and I forced a slow breath through my nose to keep everything inside where it belonged. He kept talking about my reliability, like I was a piece of equipment he had used for years without ever checking the manual. My hands tightened beneath the table, fingers curled against the edge just out of sight. In reality, I had built the backbone of the systems he claimed to oversee. The logistics chains that moved supplies through 3 states, the emergency protocols tied to weather alerts, the backup routes for fuel runs, the data frameworks for operations reporting, all of them came from late nights at my desk, while he slept soundly thinking the unit ran on its own. I never expected applause, but hearing him claim my work so boldly felt like swallowing something sharp. It sat there in my chest, heavy and unmoving. Colonel Briggs watched the entire scene with a stillness that felt more intense than any raised voice. He never interrupted, never shifted in his seat, but every time Reddick claimed another accomplishment, the colonel's attention flicked toward me. It was not a big movement, just a small turn of the eyes, yet it hit me harder than any direct question. He was cataloging the truth without saying a word. He was measuring Reddick's performance against the reaction it created in the room, and I could feel the gap widening with every sentence. Reddick kept pushing his narrative, bragging about strategic vision and hands-on leadership while ignoring the subtle discomfort spreading across the table. I watched the colonel lean back slightly, studying him like someone examining a machine that was making the wrong noise. The air thickened as the performance dragged on, the room growing smaller with each exaggerated claim. My breath stayed steady, but the tightness in my chest never loosened. It felt like holding a weight I had carried for too long. He slapped my shoulder again as he declared that the unit never missed a deadline because of his guidance. The jolt rocked me forward just enough to feel the tremor in my knees. I steadied myself and kept my expression neutral, though a pulse of anger ran through me like a muted electric current. Years of rerouted shipments, reworked schedules, fixed reports, and quiet corrections flashed through my mind in a single compressed moment. None of it belonged to him, yet he stood there building a tower of borrowed achievements. The colonel's gaze landed on me once more, steady and unreadable. I felt the weight of it settle across my shoulders, not threatening but clarifying, as if he had already drawn his conclusions and was waiting for the right moment to speak. The room felt smaller than ever. The performance was still going, but the truth had already started to push its way to the surface, slow and unstoppable. Colonel Briggs let Reddick finish the last wave of his performance before leaning forward with a calmness that cut sharper than any raised voice. He set his pen down and looked straight at him as the room settled into a tense stillness. Then he asked the question that sliced through every layer of noise in an instant. "Major, if you stopped showing up tomorrow, what exactly would break?" The words landed with a weight that made the air feel colder. Reddick blinked fast like he needed to buy time. He started talking about oversight, coordination, and strategic alignment, but none of it described anything specific. His voice grew softer as he tried to shape responsibilities out of thin air. I watched his hands move like he was building a bridge he had never walked across. The room stayed silent, waiting for clarity that never arrived. Briggs did not interrupt. He let the vagueness hang until even Reddick seemed to hear how hollow it sounded. Then the colonel asked a simple follow-up, this time directed at the officer from logistics. "Does he manage daily routing?" The officer shook his head and glanced toward me with a nervous stiffness that spoke louder than words. Briggs noted it without expression. He turned to operations. "Does he sign off on readiness reports?" The operations chief explained that those approvals went through a chain Marcus maintained. Briggs shifted his attention to supply. "Does he handle vendor coordination?" Supply admitted they copied him on emails out of courtesy but did not depend on him for any actionable steps. Each answer landed like another brick pulled from the structure Reddick had tried to stand on. Reddick began reaching for new claims, saying he facilitated interdepartmental communication and supported strategic planning. Briggs asked for examples. None came. The tension tightened across the table, a slow constriction that made every breath feel measured. My own pulse stayed steady, though my palms pressed against my legs under the table, grounding me as each truth surfaced. Briggs kept dismantling the narrative piece by piece. He checked procurement next. Do you rely on him for negotiations? Procurement answered with careful honesty, saying he only joined when escalation forced it and that most documentation came from my desk. The colonel's eyes shifted to me again, brief but unmistakable, as if confirming a fact he already knew. He wrote something in his notebook with patient strokes that carried no emotion. Reddick's voice thinned as he tried to regain footing. He mentioned leadership presence, daily oversight, and maintaining discipline, none of which held any operational weight. Briggs let him finish before asking if he drafted contracts or maintained emergency protocols. Both answers were no. Each denial pulled another thread loose, and the room felt like it was holding itself completely still to avoid becoming part of the collapse. Briggs folded his hands, giving one final sweep across the table to make sure nothing had been missed. Then he returned his gaze to Reddick with the same measured calm he had carried since the start. Interesting. So the unit runs, but not because of you. The words did not rise in volume. They did not need to. They arrived with the cold precision of a verdict. A long silence followed, heavier than anything said so far. It stretched across the room and settled over every uniform like a shift in gravity. Reddick's eyes flickered, the panic cracking through the surface as he realized no one was leaning his way anymore. I watched him lose the room without a single person moving or speaking. It was the first moment his authority truly broke, and all it took was the truth laid bare. By the next morning, Colonel Briggs had already set the first steps of the audit in motion. His orders moved through the base with a steady precision that left no room for misunderstanding. Every department was instructed to prepare full operational records, and it was clear this review would reach into every corner of our unit. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Conversations quieted, doors stayed slightly more open, and people watched the hallways as if waiting for the next name to be called. I received an email marked as a direct request from command. It asked for documentation of core responsibilities, recurring failures, system dependencies, and any operational gaps that could compromise readiness. Reading it felt like opening a door I had been standing against for years. I had kept detailed records, not to protect myself but to protect the unit from sliding into chaos whenever leadership ignored warnings. The logs were there, organized because they needed to be, each file built from long nights and quiet worry. When I began gathering the reports, I felt something shift inside me. I was no longer the person holding the base together from behind the curtain. I was the person who finally had the chance to make the truth visible. My hands moved with calm certainty as I pulled, archived emails, flagged discrepancies, and connected timelines. Every piece I compiled made the picture clearer. For the first time in a long time, I was not patching a failing structure. I was exposing one. Reddick found me before noon, storming into the office with frantic energy. His face was tight, and his voice cracked as he demanded to know what I had given them. I looked at him without flinching and felt a steadiness settle in my chest. I was only 8 minutes late, remember. The line hung in the air long enough for his anger to falter. Then I added the truth he had spent years avoiding. All I am giving them is the truth. His expression shifted from rage to something softer, almost afraid. He stepped back as if the ground under him had changed shape. I did not move toward him or explain anything further. The process was already in motion, and it no longer belonged to him. It no longer belonged to me either. It belonged to the facts. The audit moved fast once the first discrepancies appeared. HR uncovered travel claims that did not match any deployment record, and finance traced reimbursements to meals and meetings that never took place. The auditors followed each thread with the patience of people who understood how misconduct hides in plain sight. Every finding added another layer to a picture that no longer resembled oversight but something more deliberate. The reports grew thicker by the hour, and the weight of them settled across the building like cold air. Colleagues began to pull away from Reddick with a quiet instinct for survival. No one avoided him out of spite. They simply understood that the process was bigger than any individual now. The halls felt different as people stepped aside, letting him pass without greeting. Conversations shifted mid-sentence when he appeared, softening into neutral tones until he walked away. There was no celebration, only a respectful distance shaped by the gravity of what was unfolding. When the final findings reached command, the decision came with a silence that carried its own authority. 2 security staff arrived outside his office and waited for him to step through the doorway. Their posture was calm and procedural, not hostile. Reddick looked smaller than I had ever seen him, his shoulders drawn in as if trying to make room for a reality he could not escape. He carried a single folder, pressed flat against his chest, the same way a man might hold something fragile even when he knows it can no longer help him. The escort down the hallway moved slowly, each step echoing against the polished floor. No one whispered, no one smiled. Heads lowered out of quiet respect for the moment, not for the man. The only sound was the steady rhythm of boots and soft voices murmuring into radios somewhere deeper in the building. It felt like watching the closing of a chapter that had been waiting too long to end. I stood behind the glass of the conference room as he passed. He looked toward me for a moment, searching for something that neither of us could name. I held his gaze without anger, without triumph, only with the understanding that consequences eventually arrive. His eyes broke first, shifting away as he stepped into the elevator. The doors closed with a final click that dissolved into the stillness he left behind. The room Briggs chose for our meeting was small and quiet, far from the usual traffic of the command wing. I stepped inside and found him already seated at the table with a calm posture that made the air feel steady again. He nodded once as I entered, not as a formality but as a gesture of recognition. He asked if I was good. I felt the weight of the past days settle behind me as I answered that I was ready. He studied me for a moment with the kind of focus that made it clear he had not brought me here for ceremony. He spoke about the audit and the way the unit had relied on invisible labor for too long. And I understood he meant the years I had spent keeping systems alive without ever asking for a spotlight. His voice carried no judgment, only clarity. He told me the base needed restructuring in logistics, operations flow, and contingency planning, and he wanted someone who understood those systems from the inside. I realized he was offering me more than responsibility. He was offering trust. I sat across from him while he explained how leadership is not proven in a briefing room but in the quiet choices people make when no one is watching. He talked about the morning he saw me behind the loading dock and how I handed over my lunch without hesitation. He said he had come to the base early to see how people carried themselves when they thought the day had not yet begun. His boots had still carried the dust from that walk when he entered the briefing. I remembered how he watched me through Reddick's entire performance, reading every reaction, measuring me in silence. It felt strange to hear my actions spoken aloud by someone who understood their weight. I had never thought of that moment as anything more than a simple decision. Briggs leaned back in his chair and let the quiet settle for a breath, giving the meeting room to land. Then he finished with a line that felt like the closing of one chapter and the start of another. Kindness reveals character, and character reveals leadership. A week later, I walked into the conference room with a steadiness that felt new in my body. The long table looked the same as it always had, but the energy in the room had shifted in a way I could feel before anyone else arrived. I set my folder down at the seat that once belonged to Reddick, not out of triumph but out of the understanding that leadership needed a place to stand. I sat in the chair knowing I was no longer filling space. I was shaping it. Sunlight from the window warmed the table as I reached into my bag and pulled out a simple lunch wrapped in brown paper. It matched the one I had handed the colonel days earlier without thinking. Turkey on wheat, nothing fancy, just something that had always kept me going during long shifts. Opening it now felt like a quiet reminder of who I was before anyone noticed and who I still intended to be. The familiar smell grounded me in a way that made the room feel less intimidating. People began filtering in with small nods that carried a different tone than before. Their greetings were not cautious or distant. They were sincere, shaped by the knowledge that roles were clearer now and responsibility had found the right hands. I kept my focus steady, reviewing the agenda and preparing for the work that lay ahead. This was not about replacing someone. It was about rebuilding something that should have never fallen out of balance. When the door opened again, Colonel Briggs stepped inside with a soft nod in my direction. It was not grand or dramatic. It was a gesture of trust, simple and solid, the kind that anchors a person more than a speech ever could. In that moment, the weight I had carried for years settled into something lighter and more purposeful. For the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. I was seen,